Hello and welcome back to the class. We are now in topic 2, which is all about public policy and how civic innovation is created through public policy, or what is also known as a social contract. So congratulations on getting through the first week. You have a basic grasp on the purpose of government, the foundational elements that support it, and most importantly, how it matters to you. Now we go into more detail about a key function of government, which is about creating and implementing policies. Our second topic, which covers the next 2 weeks, is going to be about the function and dimensions of policies and how they work to address social problems. The goal of this section is to inform you of how complex policies can be because of the many factors that must be considered in defining, creating, and evaluating them. So here is our political landscape framework, which should now be very familiar to you and is the core framework for the course. So for this particular topic, we're going to be focused on the rules and policies dimension of the framework. And essentially, these are formal and informal expectations driving political action, behavior, and decision making. Now, it's not to say that these other elements are not important, because they are. So for instance, policies impact people. They are driven by people. Institutions actually create and sustain and implement policies. And then there are also ideologies that are underneath policies. So people think and believe certain things, which is why policies are created in certain kinds of ways. And then for the environment, there are definitely cultural and systemic and structural realities that drive why people believe that certain policies should exist. And then there are public values. And so these are generally agreed upon expectations about what should be the substance of these policies and contracts in terms of what is expected and from behavior of political actors and the institutions involved in policymaking. So we hear a lot about policies, and politicians and constituents propose policies designed to address a lot of wicked problems. But what exactly is a policy? It's essentially a contract in the form of a rule. Now, there are policies nearly everywhere. You can think about it in the context of your classroom, family, or even group of friends. In each one of these situations, there are explicit and implicit expectations for how each person will behave, responsibilities that they will have, and what people will receive in return for cooperation. In exchange for you and others following those rules and expectations, you'll receive something or may be able to avoid some kind of punishment. For instance, you may live in a home where you get a weekly allowance, but the policy is that you'll need to complete chores in order to receive it. Not completing your chores can result in the punishment of not having certain freedoms, such as socializing or free time. Now, in the context of government, a policy is essentially a formal, legal, social contract or agreement that outlines how government will address a certain issue in a society and or influence behaviors. As with all contracts, policies outline the responsibilities that government will take on to support and provide within a society, as well as what is expected of constituents. The reason for these policies is to ensure order and theoretically support public interest. Additionally, policies reflect critical societal power dynamics in terms of who is able to wield and receive various forms of power for the purpose of reward, stability, coercion, or punishment. So we can take a look at social contract theory as a way to better understand policy development. And this should be familiar because you were able to take a look at various kind of philosophical ideologies in chapter 1 through your homework, and I'm sure that social contract theory came up in one of them. So essentially, social contract theory posits that in order for society to function properly, minimize chaos, navigate catastrophic events, minimize absolute power, and manage natural urges, there must be a relationship between laws, rules, and people. Moral obligation, cooperation, and ethical behavior is the bedrock of social contracts. Now, however, that's not to say that social contract is perfect. As with any kind of theory, there are always exceptions and there are always challenges. So you can imagine in the context of a policy, you can imagine that there are various definitions of what is moral and what is ethical. And oftentimes contracts can be one-sided, leaving one party less powerful or powerless. So what are some other challenges that you can think of? So I want to make sure that you're grounded in key terminology when we're talking about policy. So law or legislation, that's a formal policy that has been legalized through a series of steps and has official approval through passage by legislatures such as Congress members. A bill is a proposal for a law that has not been officially formalized by passage among legislatures. Then you have propositions or ballot measures, and that's a proposal for legislation included on ballots and meant to be voted on by the public. So I would encourage you to take a look to see how a measure gets put on the ballot in California. And please know that there are a number of ballot measures coming up for 2022, and part of your homework is going to be actually exploring those ballot measures. So generally speaking, policies can be approached by asking who, what, when, where, how, and why. Below are some examples of key questions that need to be answered for each factor when you're trying to understand why a policy is needed, who it's going to impact, how it's going to be implemented, and so forth. So let's take a look at the first dynamic here, who. What groups or types of people and organizations are targeted by a policy? In other words, who does the policy support or punish? Additionally, it's important to ask who is behind the development of a policy. Are they specific politicians, interest groups, grassroots organizations, people, or communities? Who is responsible for fulfilling different parts of the social contract? Now let's go to the what. What does a policy actually say? What problem does the policy address? What resources are expected to be needed to fulfill the contract? What ideologies, values, philosophies inform how the policy is created? And if this is a brand new policy, what's innovative about it? And this is important because sometimes policies may not necessarily bring about enough change, or they may be addressing a brand new problem. Then let's go to the when question. Are there certain deadlines in the policy or stipulations for when certain things must happen for the policy to be properly executed? Let's look at the where. Is there a specific target location for a policy? Let's look at the how. How will it be known if the policy is successful? How will resources necessary for the execution of the policy be organized? How is the problem that the policy addresses being defined? And then why? Why is the policy even deemed to be necessary? In relation to innovation, a similar approach can be used when thinking about establishing a new policy or making changes to an existing one. So why might a new policy or change to an existing policy be necessary? So for instance, it could be a policy is outdated or a new issue or problem has arisen that has never been before challenged. How exactly will a new policy or change be different and potentially beneficial? What is necessary to support a new policy or change? And will that particular innovation put a strain or on existing policy resources? The who, what, when, where, why, and how line of questions can be summed up in this classic approach for public policy making. So first you have the problem definition, and that's identifying and describing what problems need a policy solution. And then you have agenda setting, and this is how identified and defined problems are prioritized by government and other stakeholders for a specific policy action. And then you have solution design and implementation. And that's determining what will be actually elements of a policy and how it will come to life in terms of real action. And then you have evaluation, and that's about assessing and quantifying the impact, success, and or failure of a policy. And then lastly, termination. That's the formal process of ending a policy or making it inactive. Now again, this is an overall framework, overall approach. I just want you to know that policy making, implementation, agenda setting, design and solution setting, evaluation, termination can be quite a messy process, but in order for you to have the basics, these are the basic 5 elements of the classic approach for public policy making. All right. Now it's really important here to make a difference between and know the difference between policy development versus policy implementation. Oftentimes policies may get a bad rap because they were implemented incorrectly or unsuccessfully. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other elements of the policy development, such as how it was conceived, how it was developed, how it was written, and how it was shared, was problematic. So one way to think about this is using the analogy of a recipe. So I'm sure that you can all think of what your favorite food is. Now mine is macaroni and cheese. So for me, I have had good macaroni and cheese, bad macaroni and cheese, and just horrible macaroni and cheese. Now when I've had bad or horrible macaroni and cheese, it doesn't mean that I hate macaroni and cheese overall. What it means is possibly that the recipe was wrong, the quality of the ingredients were not right, or something just went wrong in the cooking process. So it's really important for you to understand that the difference between, again, policy development versus policy implementation. The idea and the drive behind a policy could be very good. However, things can go wrong in the actual implementation process. So let's take a look to see what are some of the policy areas or priorities that citizens or constituents, want to see addressed. So here we have some information from the Pew Research Center, and these are the things that the public wants the government to prioritize. So as you can see at the top, people want the government to prioritize strengthening the economy, dealing with the outbreak, of course, and improving job situations. And when we look at this is a really good indicator about perhaps where the public wants policy directions and policy agendas and policy priorities to go. All right, now let's look at classic policy topology. Now this was developed by Theodore Lowy, and generally we can see policy in several categories. So according to Lowy, he developed 4 overall categories in which to place public policy. So first you have regulatory policies, and those aim to mitigate criminal, corrupt, or unethical behaviors that could do harm to groups and people by limiting behaviors and actions. So examples of these types of policies could be laws designed to control quality of food and drugs, as well as labor law to protect employees. Then you have distributive policy, and that's about the collection, management of resources to ensure that government provides goods and services to groups and people. And maybe the first thing that comes to mind are policies around tax collection. Then you have redistributive policy, and those focus on redistributing resources to ensure equity. So examples of those kinds of policies might be grants. For example, you might be familiar with Pell Grants, Medicaid, and tax credits. And then you have constituent or constitutive policies, and that enables governments to create new organizational structures and mechanisms to address a specific issue. So for example, after 9/11, you had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. So as we wind down, I really encourage you to go to these 2 links, the Public Policy Institute of California and the Policy Agenda for California. So these 2 links are going to give you really good insight into some key policy areas in California, many of which affect us. All right, so the next steps is to go through this lecture again, review the supplemental learning material, start book chapter 2 in the exercises, and please make sure that you are actually going through the embedded links in the chapter and in the learning material so that you can really take a deeper dive into the concepts and into the definitions and things of that nature. So make sure that you complete your book chapter and your exercises by February 27th at 11:59 p.m. And please also make sure that you're not just using Google Scholar to actually do your research for the assignments. The CalState LA Library has a really, really great body of resources to help you, and you can really get a lot of good information, especially if you can't find anything on Google Scholar. And as always, if you need any help, please let me know, and have a great week. I'm looking forward to seeing you all at our Zoom Hangout session.